Blood trickled from Daisy Monroe's split lip as she staggered through the driving rain, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other gripping a small carpet bag containing everything she owned in the world. The October winds of 1875 howled across the Colorado plains, cutting through her threadbare shawl as nightfall approached. 6 months pregnant and fleeing from a husband whose knuckles had become all too familiar with her skin, Daisy had nowhere left to run. "Just a little further," she whispered to her unborn child, trudging down the muddy road that led away from Denver. The city lights had faded behind her hours ago, replaced by scattered homesteads and ranches that dotted the foothills of the Rockies. Her feet, swollen and blistered in boots never meant for such a journey, threatened to give out with each step. The rain intensified, pelting her already soaked form as darkness descended completely. Ahead, through sheets of water, a faint light glowed, a lone lantern hanging from a porch. A small ranch house stood silhouetted against the stormy sky, smoke curling from its chimney despite the downpour. Daisy hesitated at the fence line. She'd sworn never to place her fate in a man's hands again, not after what Thomas had done to her. But the baby kicked inside her, a reminder that her decisions no longer affected just herself. Lightning flashed overhead, followed by a thunderclap that shook the very ground. With trembling hands, she pushed open the gate and made her way to the front door. Her knuckles rapped weakly against the weathered wood. No answer came. Shivering uncontrollably now, she knocked harder, desperation lending strength to her frozen fingers. The door swung open, spilling golden lamplight onto the porch. A tall man stood framed in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the space. Dark hair curled damply at his collar, and cautious eyes studied her from beneath a furrowed brow. "Madam?" His voice was deep but gentle, tinged with concern rather than suspicion. "Please," Daisy managed, her voice barely audible above the storm. The words died in her throat as a wave of dizziness washed over her. She swayed, darkness encroaching at the edges of her vision. The last thing she felt was strong arms catching her before she hit the ground. When Daisy awoke, she lay on something soft, wrapped in blankets that smelled of pine and wood smoke. For a disorienting moment, she thought she might be back in her childhood home in Missouri. Then the ache in her ribs and the throb of her bruised cheek brought reality crashing back. She sat up with a gasp, hands immediately going to her stomach. "Easy now," came a voice from across the room. "You're safe here." The man from the doorway sat in a rocking chair, his large frame making the furniture appear smaller than it was. In the light of the fire and oil lamps, she could see him clearly now, perhaps 30 years of age, with features that might have been carved from the surrounding mountains. A day's worth of stubble darkened his jaw, but his eyes were kind beneath the brim of the hat he'd removed and set aside. "Where am I?" Daisy asked, her throat painfully dry. "Quartermain Ranch, about 15 miles outside Denver." He stood slowly, as if trying not to startle her, and moved to pour water from a pitcher into a cup. "Name's Matthew Quartermain. Most folks call me Matt." Daisy accepted the water with shaking hands. "Thank you, Mr. Quartermain. I'm Daisy Monroe." "Mrs. Monroe?" he asked, his eyes flicking briefly to her wedding band. She stiffened. "Yes," Matthew nodded, asking nothing further as he retreated to give her space. "Your little one seemed to weather the storm just fine. You were talking to it in your sleep." Daisy's hand moved protectively over her belly. "How long was I unconscious?" "Just a couple hours. I sent for Doc Jenkins from town, but this weather." He gestured toward the windows where rain still lashed against the glass. "Might be morning before he can make it out." "I don't need a doctor," Daisy said quickly. "I just need to rest, and then I'll be on my way." Matthew's expression remained neutral, but his eyes betrayed concern. "With all due respect, madam, you're in no condition to go anywhere tonight or tomorrow from the look of things." Daisy knew he was right. Her body felt as though it had been trampled by horses, and the baby had been unusually active since her fall. Still, she couldn't stay. Thomas would be looking for her as soon as he sobered up enough to notice she was gone. "I can't impose," she said softly. "It wouldn't be proper." Matthew moved to the fireplace, adding another log. "My mother raised me better than to turn away someone in need, especially in her condition." A small smile tugged at his lips. Besides, she'd have my hide if she knew I'd sent a pregnant woman back into a storm like this. Your mother lives here too? Daisy asked, relief flooding through her at the thought of another woman's presence. The smile faded from Matthew's face. No, madam. She passed on 3 years ago. It's just me now. He cleared his throat. And the ranch hands, though they bunk in the bunkhouse out back. Daisy sank back against the pillows, torn between propriety and necessity. Her eyelids felt impossibly heavy. Just for tonight, then, she conceded, already drifting back toward sleep. Just tonight. She didn't hear his response as exhaustion claimed her once more. Morning brought clearing skies and new pain. Daisy winced as she tried to sit up, every muscle protesting the movement. The smell of coffee and frying bacon drifted from somewhere nearby, making her empty stomach clench with hunger. Good morning. Matthew appeared in the doorway, separating the bedroom from what must be the kitchen. He carried a tray laden with food and stood awkwardly, as if unsure whether to enter. Thought you might be hungry. Daisy pulled the blanket higher, suddenly aware that she wore only her chemise beneath it. Matthew, she realized with mortification, had removed her sodden dress and boots. Reading her discomfort, Matthew quickly explained, "Your things are drying by the fire." I did what was necessary to prevent fever, nothing more. I have some of my mother's old dresses if you'd like something to wear in the meantime. Thank you, Daisy murmured, accepting the tray as he set it carefully across her lap. The food was simple but plentiful: eggs, bacon, biscuits still steaming from the oven, and a cup of strong coffee. This is very kind of you. It's nothing fancy. Bachelor cooking, he said with a self-deprecating smile that transformed his weathered features. I'll fetch one of those dresses while you eat. When he returned, he carried a faded blue calico dress and placed it at the foot of the bed. I'll give you some privacy. Call if you need anything. Alone, Daisy ate ravenously, realizing she hadn't had a proper meal in days. Thomas had been withholding food as another form of control, claiming they couldn't afford to feed her lazy, useless self. The thought of her husband sent a chill through her, despite the warm room and hot food. After eating, she struggled into the borrowed dress, which hung loosely everywhere except across her pregnant belly. The previous owner had been taller and broader than Daisy's petite frame. Still, it was clean and comfortable, the fabric soft from many washings. She found a brush on the dresser and attempted to tame her tangled auburn hair, wincing when she caught sight of her reflection in a small mirror hanging on the wall. Her right eye was swollen and discolored, her lips split at the corner. No wonder Matthew had looked at her with such concern. Taking a deep breath, she ventured from the bedroom into the main part of the house. It was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a spacious kitchen and living area dominated by a stone fireplace. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that surprised her: not just practical manuals on ranching and animal husbandry, but novels, poetry, and history books. Matthew stood at the kitchen counter, washing dishes with his back to her. Without his coat, she could see the breadth of his shoulders beneath a simple cotton shirt, sleeves rolled up to expose forearms corded with muscle. He worked methodically, movements efficient and practiced. I can do that, Daisy offered, startling him. He turned, wiping his hands on a towel. No need, you should be resting. His eyes traveled over her, taking in the ill-fitting dress and her bruised face, but his expression revealed nothing beyond polite concern. I've imposed enough already. The least I can do is help with the dishes. Daisy moved to the basin, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Matthew didn't argue but stepped aside to give her room. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, Daisy washing while he dried and put away the dishes, his movements revealing an intimate knowledge of his kitchen. Doc Jenkins should be by later today, Matthew said finally, hanging the last plate in a cupboard. Roads will be muddy, but passable now that the rain's stopped. I told you, I don't need, Daisy began, but Matthew cut her off with a gentle firmness. You collapsed on my porch last night, Mrs. Monroe, you're carrying a child, and those bruises didn't come from any fall. His eyes met hers, unwavering but compassionate. I'm not asking what happened or who's responsible, that's your business. but making sure you and your baby are healthy that became my business when you knocked on my door." Daisy looked away, unable to hold his gaze. No one had spoken to her with such direct concern in years. Certainly not Thomas, whose words had grown as cruel as his fists over their 3 years of marriage. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew nodded once as if the matter were settled. "Can I ask where you were headed last night? You're a long way from town to be traveling on foot." "I don't know," Daisy admitted, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. "Away, just away." Something flickered in Matthew's eyes, understanding, perhaps. "Well," he said after a moment, "you're welcome to stay until you figure it out, or until the doc says you're fit to travel, whichever comes first." Before Daisy could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Matthew moved swiftly to the window, tension visible in the set of his shoulders. "It's just Doc Jenkins," he said, relaxing. "Sooner than I expected." Daisy instinctively stepped back from the window, heart racing. "Please don't tell him my name or anything about me." Matthew turned, studying her with those perceptive eyes. "You're running from someone." It wasn't a question. "Yes." No point in denying the obvious. He considered this, then nodded slowly. "All right, far as the doc needs to know, you're just a friend passing through who took ill." "I won't say more than that." The relief that flooded through Daisy was so intense she had to grip the back of a chair to steady herself. "Thank you." Doc Jenkins proved to be a weathered man in his 60s with kind eyes and gentle hands. He asked few questions as he examined Daisy, noting her injuries with a professional detachment that nonetheless couldn't entirely mask his concern. "The baby seems healthy," he concluded, packing his instruments back into his black bag. "Strong heartbeat. But you, young lady, are suffering from exhaustion and malnutrition. I'm prescribing bed rest for at least 3 days, plenty of fluids and regular meals." He glanced at Matthew, who had remained respectfully in the other room during the examination. "Make sure she eats, Matt. That child she's carrying needs nourishment." "Yes, sir," Matthew replied from the doorway. The doctor lowered his voice. "Those bruises weren't accidental. You want to tell me what happened?" Daisy shook her head, eyes downcast. Doc Jenkins sighed. "I've been practicing medicine in these parts for 40 years. Seen too many women in your condition." He patted her hand gently. "Whatever you're running from, you did the right thing. Stay here with Matt for a while. He's a good man, won't let any harm come to you." After the doctor left, Matthew brought Daisy a cup of tea and sat across from her at the kitchen table. "Doc's right about the rest," he said. "You're welcome to stay until you're stronger." "I can't pay you," Daisy said bluntly. "I have almost nothing. I'm not asking for payment." "Then what are you asking for?" The question came out sharper than intended, born of years of learning that men always wanted something in return. If Matthew was offended, he didn't show it. "Nothing. My mother would never forgive me if I turned away someone in need." A wry smile crossed his face. "Besides, I could use some company besides the ranch hands. They're good men, but conversation tends to revolve around cattle and horses." Despite herself, Daisy felt an answering smile tug at her lips. "I don't know much about either, I'm afraid." Even better, a fresh topic of conversation. Matthew rose, collecting their cups. "Rest today. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, I can show you around the place." True to his word, Matthew left Daisy to rest for the remainder of the day, bringing her meals and checking on her periodically, but otherwise giving her space. The ranch house was quiet save for the occasional creak of timbers and the distant lowing of cattle. Daisy slept fitfully, dreams filled with Thomas's rage-contorted face and grasping hands. She woke several times in a cold sweat, momentarily disoriented before remembering where she was. Each time, the steady ticking of a clock on the mantel and the knowledge that Matthew Quartermain was somewhere nearby eventually lulled her back to sleep. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect autumn day in the Colorado foothills. Daisy awakened feeling more rested than she had in months. She found her own dress cleaned and pressed, hanging over a chair by the bed. After dressing and attempting to make herself presentable, she followed the smell of coffee to the kitchen. Matthew stood at the stove, his back to her as he tended to something sizzling in a cast iron pan. "Good morning." Daisy said softly. He turned, a genuine smile lighting his features. Mrs. Monroe, you're looking better today. Please call me Daisy, and I feel better, thank you. Daisy then. He gestured to a chair. Breakfast is almost ready. Hope you like flapjacks. They ate together, the silence between them gradually becoming comfortable rather than awkward. Daisy found herself studying Matthew when he wasn't looking the way his large hands somehow managed to be gentle with delicate things. The crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. The streak of early gray at his temple that suggested he'd seen his share of hardship despite his relatively young age. "Still up for that tour?" he asked when they'd finished eating. "Nothing strenuous, I promise. Doc would have my hide." Outside, the ranch sprawled across rolling foothills, a mixture of pasture and woodland. A large barn stood nearby, along with several smaller outbuildings and a bunkhouse. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully, their forms dark against the golden autumn grass. "It's beautiful," Daisy said sincerely, breathing in the crisp mountain air. "Been in my family for 2 generations," Matthew replied, pride evident in his voice. "My father built this place from nothing. Came out from Pennsylvania after the war, the Mexican one, not the recent unpleasantness. Met my mother here in Colorado. She was a school teacher." "That explains the books," Daisy said, remembering the well-stocked shelves. Matthew nodded. "She taught me to read before I could properly ride." Said a man needed both skills out here, one for his livelihood, one for his soul. He smiled at the memory. Father thought she was being impractical, but he indulged her, and me. They walked slowly toward the barn, where sounds of activity could be heard. "My ranch hands," Matthew explained. "Good men, all of them. They'll keep their distance if that's what you prefer." "I don't want to disrupt your work," Daisy said, suddenly self-conscious. "You won't." Matthew's voice was firm. "Now, would you like to meet the horses? I've got one gentle mare who might enjoy a lady's company for a change." The days that followed fell into a pattern. Daisy gradually regained her strength, the color returning to her cheeks as regular meals and rest worked their healing magic. True to his word, Matthew asked no questions about her past, though sometimes she caught him looking at her with concern when a loud noise made her flinch or when she instinctively ducked away from a raised hand. For his part, Matthew proved to be unfailingly kind but respectful of her boundaries. He never entered her room without knocking, never touched her, even accidentally, and made sure she had everything she needed without making her feel like an invalid or a burden. A week passed, then 2. October gave way to November, bringing the first dusting of snow to the foothills. Daisy's bruises faded, though the deeper ones, the ones inside, remained tender. Still, she found herself smiling more, speaking more freely, especially during the long evenings when Matthew would read aloud from one of his books while she mended clothing or helped prepare food for the following day. "My mother's favorite," Matthew said one evening, closing a volume of Tennyson's poetry. "She had unusual taste for a frontier woman." "She sounds remarkable," Daisy replied, setting aside the shirt she'd been patching. "You must miss her terribly." "Every day," Matthew stared into the fire. "She and my father built something special here, not just the ranch, but a life with meaning. After they were gone, father 5 years ago, mother 3, I nearly sold the place. Couldn't see the point of keeping it going just for myself." "What changed your mind?" Matthew considered the question. "Realized this land was in my blood, and I had men depending on me for their livelihoods, families, responsibilities." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Easier to keep going forward than to start over elsewhere." Daisy understood that sentiment all too well. "I should know that by now," she said quietly. Matthew waited, saying nothing, giving her space to continue or not as she chose. "I married Thomas Monroe when I was 18, Daisy said after a long pause, surprising herself with the admission. "He was charming, handsome. Said all the right things to a girl eager to escape a father who drank too much and used his belt too freely." Her hands rested protectively on her belly as she continued. "The first year was tolerable. He had a temper, but it rarely turned physical. Then he lost his job at the bank in St. Louis. We moved to Denver for a fresh start." A bitter laugh escaped her. "That's what he called it, a fresh start. Things got worse," Matthew asked gently when she fell silent. Daisy nodded. He found work as a clerk for a shipping company. The pay was less, the hours longer. He started drinking. Gambling, coming home angry. Her voice grew distant. The first time he really hit me, not just a slap. I told myself it was an accident. The second time I told myself he was under strain. By the 10th time I'd stopped making excuses but couldn't see a way out. And then you discovered you were expecting, Matthew guessed. Yes, I thought it would change things, that becoming a father would make him. She shook her head at her own naivety. It made him worse, said I'd trapped him, that I'd done it on purpose to keep him from leaving. Matthew's hands tightened on the arms of his chair, but he remained silent, letting her tell her story at her own pace. 3 weeks ago, he came home drunk, angrier than I'd ever seen him, said he'd lost his job again, that it was my fault for being such a burden. Daisy closed her eyes, reliving the terror of that night. He hit me so hard I fell against the stove. I thought I was certain he'd killed the baby. A tear slid down her cheek. When he finally passed out, I packed what I could carry and ran. I had a little money saved hidden in the hem of a dress where he wouldn't find it. Took the stage as far as it would take me, then started walking. I didn't know where I was going, just that I couldn't stay. And you ended up on my doorstep, Matthew said softly. Yes. Daisy opened her eyes, meeting his gaze directly. I've imposed on your kindness far too long. The baby isn't due for nearly 3 months, but I need to find work, a place of my own. You'll do no such thing, Matthew said, his voice gentle but brooking no argument. Winter's coming on. You're in no condition to be working, and you have nowhere to go. Stay here at least until spring. I can't just— You can, he interrupted, and you will, for the child's sake, if not your own. Daisy wanted to protest further, but found she lacked the will. The truth was, she felt safe here in a way she hadn't in years. Matthew Quartermain had shown her nothing but kindness without expectation or demand. The ranch had become a haven, and the thought of leaving filled her with dread. Until spring, she agreed reluctantly. But I insist on earning my keep. I can cook, clean, mend. I'm not an invalid. Matthew smiled, relief evident in his expression. Deal. Though I warn you, my men might mutiny if you take over the cooking entirely. They've grown accustomed to my biscuits. Which could double as horseshoes, Daisy retorted without thinking, then covered her mouth in mortification. To her surprise, Matthew threw back his head and laughed, a rich, full sound that filled the room. Finally, some honesty. I've been waiting for someone to tell me the truth about my cooking for years. His laughter was infectious. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Daisy found herself laughing to a rusty, tentative sound at first, then freer, until tears of mirth rather than sorrow streamed down her face. Something shifted between them that night. A wall crumbled, allowing a cautious friendship to take root in its place. Over the following weeks, as the first true snows of winter blanketed the ranch, Daisy and Matthew settled into a comfortable routine. She took over much of the cooking and household management, discovering a satisfaction in caring for a home without fear of criticism or violence. Matthew taught her about the ranch operations, seeming to value her opinions and suggestions. The baby grew active, kicking and rolling within her, especially in the evenings when Matthew would read aloud. I think the little one likes Dickens, Daisy remarked one night, placing a hand on her belly where a foot or elbow had just jabbed sharply. Matthew looked up from the book, his expression softening. May I? He asked hesitantly, gesturing toward her rounded stomach. The request caught Daisy off guard. Thomas had never shown any interest in feeling the baby move, had in fact recoiled from her changing body with disgust. But Matthew's face held only wonder and gentle curiosity. Of course, she said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. Matthew set the book aside and knelt beside her chair. With infinite care, he placed his large hand where Daisy indicated. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the baby shifted, delivering a solid kick right against his palm. Matthew's face transformed, eyes widening in delighted amazement. Strong little thing, he murmured, a smile spreading across his features. Going to be a fine rider someday with legs like that. Or a dancer, Daisy suggested, acutely aware of the warmth of his hand through the fabric of her dress. Or both. Matthew's eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them, a moment of shared joy in the miracle of new life. Then, seeming to remember himself, he withdrew his hand and returned to his chair, picking up the book once more. But that night marked another subtle shift in their relationship. Matthew began taking a more active interest in preparations for the baby's arrival, fashioning a cradle from pine wood in his spare hours and riding into town to purchase soft flannel for swaddling cloths. The ranch hands, taking their cue from their boss, brought gifts as well: a handmade quilt from one man's wife, a tiny pair of moccasins from the half-Ute wrangler who rarely spoke but smiled shyly when Daisy thanked him. As Christmas approached, the weather turned bitter. Blizzards swept down from the mountains, keeping everyone close to hearth and home. Matthew insisted Daisy remain indoors, taking on the outdoor chores himself despite her protests. "I managed fine before you arrived," he reminded her, stamping snow from his boots after tending the livestock one particularly frigid morning. "Besides, you've made this place more of a home in 2 months than I managed in 3 years. That's contribution enough." It was true. Daisy had brought life back to the Quartermain Ranch house. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, crafted from fabric Matthew had purchased in town. The rooms were immaculate, the pantry organized, meals served at regular hours. She'd even decorated for Christmas, fashioning garlands from pine boughs and berries gathered before the heavy snows came on Christmas Eve, after a simple but satisfying supper shared with the ranch hands in the main house. Matthew presented Daisy with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much," he said almost shyly as she untied the twine binding it. Inside lay a silver hairbrush and hand mirror, delicately engraved with a pattern of roses. "Oh, Matthew," Daisy breathed, running her fingers over the fine workmanship. "They're beautiful." "They were my mother's," he explained. "She'd want you to have them, said every woman deserves something pretty of her own." Tears welled in Daisy's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. Thomas had never given her presents, claiming such things were frivolous wastes of money. "I didn't get you anything," she said, ashamed. Matthew shook his head. "You've given this house life again, given me." He hesitated, seemingly searching for the right words. "Company, friendship, that's gift enough." Later, after the ranch hands had returned to their quarters and the house grew quiet save for the crackling of the fire, Daisy sat brushing her hair with her new brush. The repetitive motion was soothing, and she found her thoughts drifting to the man who had become her protector and friend. She couldn't deny the growing warmth she felt in Matthew's presence, the quickening of her pulse when he smiled at her, the comfort she took in his steady, reliable nature. But she was still legally bound to Thomas, still carrying another man's child. And Matthew had shown no sign of seeing her as anything more than someone in need of sanctuary. A sharp pain in her lower back interrupted her reverie, making her gasp. She set down the brush, waiting to see if it would pass. When it did, she attributed it to the long day and retired to bed, unaware that it was the first harbinger of what was to come. The pain returned in the early hours of the morning, waking Daisy from a deep sleep. Stronger this time, it wrapped around her midsection like a vise before gradually releasing. She sat up, hands cradling her belly, a thread of fear winding through her. It was too soon, almost 8 weeks too soon for the baby to arrive. But as the pains continued, growing closer together and more intense, she could no longer deny what was happening. Struggling to her feet, she made her way to Matthew's door, knocking urgently. He appeared almost instantly, hair tousled from sleep but eyes alert. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. "The baby's coming," Daisy gasped as another contraction seized her. Matthew's calm efficiency was a blessing in the chaos that followed. He helped Daisy back to her bed, built up the fire, and set water to boil before pulling on his coat. "I'm going for Doc Jenkins," he said, already heading for the door. "The men will hear me saddling up. I'll send one in to stay with you until I return." "But the snow," Daisy began, frightened by the thought of him riding out into the blizzard conditions. "Don't worry about me," Matthew said firmly. "Just focus on yourself and that baby. I'll be back with the doc before you know it." True to Matthew's prediction, one of the ranch hands, an older man named Jim with grown children of his own, appeared at the bedroom door moments after Matthew's departure. "Boss said you might need some company, madam," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "My Sarah had 6 little ones, so I'm no stranger to birthing times. Anything you need." Daisy was grateful for the man's matter-of-fact presence as the labor progressed. He kept the fire stoked, brought her water, and spoke soothingly of inconsequential things to distract her from the increasingly powerful contractions. Hours passed with no sign of Matthew or the doctor. The storm outside had intensified, wind howling around the eaves of the house like a living thing. Daisy tried not to imagine Matthew lost in the blizzard, tried to focus instead on the task at hand, bringing her child safely into the world. By mid-morning, the pains were coming hard and fast. Jim had gone to fetch more water when Daisy felt an overwhelming urge to push. She cried out, unable to help herself, and the ranch hand came running back. "Madam," he asked, alarmed by the change in her. "The baby," Daisy gasped. "It's coming now." Jim's weathered face paled slightly, but he nodded with determination. "All right then, let me just wash up. My Sarah would tan my hide if I touched a newborn with dirty hands." He had just returned to her side, sleeves rolled up and hands clean, when the sound of the front door banging open reached them. Heavy footsteps crossed the main room, and then Matthew was there, snow crusting his coat and hat, his face red from cold. "Doc's right behind me," he said, breathing hard. "Got caught in a drift about a mile out, had to dig the horses out." His eyes fell on Daisy, taking in her condition with a quick glance. "How is she?" "Baby's coming right now, boss," Jim replied, relief evident in his voice. "Don't think it's waiting on no doctor." Matthew didn't hesitate. He shed his coat and hat, washed his hands thoroughly in the basin, and took Jim's place beside the bed. "Tell me what to do," he said to Daisy, his voice calm and steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. What followed was the most intense experience of Daisy's life. With Matthew's unwavering support and Jim's occasional guidance from his wife's experiences, she brought her child into the world as the storm raged outside. When the baby finally slipped free, tiny, red-faced, and indignant, Matthew caught the little form in his large hands with a gentleness that brought tears to Daisy's eyes. "A boy," he announced, his voice thick with emotion. "A perfect little boy." He laid the infant on Daisy's chest, where the newborn's cries gradually subsided as he felt his mother's warmth. Daisy stared down at her son in wonder, counting fingers and toes, marveling at the miracle of his existence despite everything that had tried to prevent it. Doc Jenkins arrived 20 minutes later, huffing and puffing from his journey through the snow. He examined both mother and child with careful thoroughness, his expression growing increasingly relieved as he did so. "Well, he's early, but he seems healthy enough," the doctor pronounced, watching the infant nurse hungrily at Daisy's breast. "Good color, good lungs, good appetite. Keep him warm and feed him often. Nature has a way of making up for an early arrival." After the doctor had gone to rest in the spare room and Jim had returned to the bunkhouse with news of the birth, Matthew sat beside Daisy's bed, watching her with her son. "What will you call him?" he asked softly. Daisy looked down at the sleeping infant. She'd never discussed names with Thomas, who had shown no interest in such matters, but she'd been thinking about it during the quiet winter evenings at the ranch. "William," she said decisively, "after my grandfather, William James Monroe." She hesitated, then added, "Though I suppose legally he should have his father's name." "The law isn't always right," Matthew said, a hint of steel beneath his gentle tone. "A man who raises his hand to his wife forfeits the privilege of passing on his name in my book." Daisy felt a rush of gratitude for this man who had become her champion. "William it is, then," Matthew smiled, reaching out to lightly touch the baby's downy head. "Welcome to the world, William. You picked a fine day to arrive Christmas." "Christmas?" Daisy looked up in surprise. In the drama of labor and birth, she'd lost track of time completely. "Yes, madam, your son shares his birthday with the Christ child." Matthew's expression was tender as he regarded the small family. "A blessed day indeed." The weeks that followed were a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and precious little sleep. Despite his early arrival, William thrived, gaining weight steadily and developing a hearty cry that Matthew joked could wake the cattle in the north pasture. Matthew proved to be an unexpected blessing during this time. He hired a local woman to help with household chores, insisted Daisy rest whenever the baby slept, and often walked the floor with William in the middle of the night, crooning old cowboy songs when the infant was fussy. Watching him with her son, Daisy felt something unfurl within her heart, a tender, fragile emotion she was almost afraid to name. Matthew treated William as if he were his own, with a natural affection and patience that never faltered, even during the most challenging moments. By February, life had settled into a new routine. The bitter cold of deep winter still gripped the land, but inside the ranch house, warmth and contentment reigned. William was growing plump and increasingly alert, regarding the world with curious blue eyes that Daisy suspected might eventually darken to match her own brown ones. It was during this peaceful period that the past came crashing back into their lives. Daisy was hanging freshly washed diapers by the kitchen stove to dry when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Curious, she moved to the window. Visitors were rare during winter when travel was difficult at best. What she saw made her blood freeze in her veins. Thomas Monroe sat atop a rented wagon, his face set in the hard lines she remembered all too well. He was sober, judging by his posture, which somehow made his arrival even more terrifying. Thomas drunk was dangerous. Thomas sober and determined was calculating. William lay sleeping in his cradle nearby. Daisy scooped him up, wrapping him securely in a blanket despite his protesting whimper at being disturbed. Her mind raced. Matthew was out with the men, checking on a pregnant heifer in the far pasture. He wouldn't be back for hours. A heavy knock sounded at the door. Daisy retreated to the bedroom, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would wake the baby. She had no illusions about what Thomas wanted. He'd come to reclaim his property, her and the child she'd borne, Daisy. Thomas's voice, deceptively pleasant, called through the door. "Open up, darling, I know you're in there." She remained silent, clutching William to her chest. The knocking came again, harder this time. "Don't make me break this door down." The false pleasantness was already fraying, revealing the anger beneath. "You've had your little adventure. It's time to come home where you belong." Daisy looked frantically around the room for an escape route. The window was an option, but with a newborn in her arms and deep snow outside, she wouldn't get far. And where would she go? The bunkhouse was empty, the men all out with Matthew. The sound of splintering wood told her Thomas had made good on his threat. He was breaking in. Daisy tucked William into the far corner of the bedroom, piling blankets around him to keep him warm and hopefully hidden from immediate view. Then she moved to stand in the doorway between bedroom and main room, determined to keep Thomas from reaching her son. Thomas stood in the ruined doorway, snow swirling around his feet. He was thinner than when she'd left, his once handsome face hardened into something ugly and mean. His eyes narrowed when he saw her. "There you are," he said, stepping into the house and removing his gloves with deliberate slowness. "Been looking everywhere for you. That stunt you pulled running off, taking what's mine that wasn't very wifely, was it?" "Leave, Thomas," Daisy said, amazed that her voice didn't tremble. "You're not welcome here," he laughed, the sound chilling in its lack of humor. "Not welcome. In a place where my wife has been living with another man, I think the law might see things differently, Daisy girl." "Nothing improper has happened here," Daisy responded, though she knew Thomas wouldn't believe or care about the truth. "Mr. Quartermain has been a perfect gentleman." "I bet he has," Thomas sneered, moving farther into the room. His eyes scanned the domestic scene, the baby clothes drying by the fire, the cradle visible just behind Daisy. "So you had it then, boy or girl, that's none of your concern." Thomas's face darkened. "Everything about you is my concern. You're my wife, that's my child." "And we're leaving this place today." "No," Daisy stood her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "I'm not going anywhere with you, and neither is my son." "Son, is it?" Something calculating entered Thomas's expression. "A boy needs his father, Daisy." "What will you tell him when he's older?" That his mother was a whore who ran away from her lawful husband to live with some rancher. I'll tell him his father was a violent drunk who beat his mother, Daisy shot back, anger overriding fear. I'll tell him I left to save his life and mine. Thomas moved with the suddenness of a striking snake, his hand connected with Daisy's cheek, sending her staggering backward. You've gotten bold while you've been away, he growled, advancing on her. Need to remind you of your place. He grabbed her arm, twisting it painfully. Get whatever you need for the boy. We're leaving, now. Let her go. The voice from the doorway was quiet but carried an unmistakable threat. Thomas whirled, dragging Daisy with him. Matthew stood in the broken doorway, rifle held casually but expertly in his hands. Despite the weapon, there was nothing threatening in his posture, just a deadly calm certainty. This is between me and my wife, Thomas said, though his grip on Daisy's arm loosened slightly. No concern of yours, Cowboy. You made it my concern when you broke into my home and put your hands on a woman under my protection. Matthew's voice remained even, but his eyes had hardened to flint. Now let her go and step back. Or what, you'll shoot me, Thomas scoffed, for claiming what's legally mine. No court would convict me. I'm not concerned with courts right now. Matthew took a single step forward. Last chance, let her go. Something in his tone must have convinced Thomas of his seriousness. He released Daisy's arm, shoving her away from him as he did so. She stumbled but remained upright, moving quickly to stand beside Matthew. This isn't over, Thomas said, glaring at them both. She's still my wife, that's still my son, the law's on my side. Perhaps, Matthew conceded, but you're on my land now and I'm asking you to leave. If you choose not to, I'll consider it trespassing and I'll act accordingly. He gestured meaningfully with the rifle. Thomas's eyes darted between them, calculating his odds. Finally, he spat on the floor. Fine, have your whore for now, but I'll be back with the sheriff next time. He backed toward the door, maintaining eye contact with Matthew until he reached the threshold. Only then did he turn and stomp to his waiting wagon, climbing aboard with angry, jerky movements. Matthew waited until the wagon had disappeared down the long drive before lowering the rifle and turning to Daisy. Are you all right? Did he hurt you? I'm fine, she assured him, though her cheek stung where Thomas had struck her. But William, as if on cue, a cry rose from the bedroom. Daisy rushed to retrieve her son, checking him over anxiously before returning to Matthew's side. He means what he says, she said quietly, bouncing William gently to soothe him. He'll come back with the law and they'll side with him. A husband has rights to his wife and child, no matter how cruel he's been. Matthew's expression was grim as he secured the broken door as best he could. Then we need to make sure you're not his wife anymore. Daisy stared at him, scarcely daring to hope. Divorce. But that could take years and the scandal, not divorce, Matthew interrupted. Widowhood? What are you saying? Matthew led her to the kitchen table, taking William so she could sit down. He cradled the infant with practiced ease as he explained. Thomas Monroe needs to disappear. Permanently? Seeing the alarm on Daisy's face, he quickly added, I'm not suggesting murder. I'm suggesting we create a story, one that frees you legally and keeps you and William safe. Over the next hour, as the baby dozed in his arms, Matthew outlined his plan. Thomas Monroe, he suggested, should meet with an unfortunate accident on his way back to Denver, an accident with no survivors but plenty of witnesses to confirm his identity. My foreman, Joe, has a brother who works for the railroad, Matthew explained. There was a derailment last week near Pueblo, several unidentified bodies. With the right documentation and a few well-placed bribes, Thomas Monroe could officially be among them. But Thomas himself will be paid to disappear, Matthew finished for her. A significant sum, enough to start over somewhere far away, in exchange for never contacting you again. If he refuses, he gets nothing, and I make certain every unsavory detail of his treatment of you becomes public knowledge. Even with the law on his side, no judge wants that kind of scandal in his courtroom. Daisy studied Matthew's face, searching for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. She found none, only determination to protect her and William, whatever the cost. Why would you do this? She asked finally. You hardly know me. We've not even known each other 4 months. Matthew looked down at the sleeping infant in his arms, then back at Daisy, his expression softening. 4 months can be a lifetime depending on how you live them. He took a deep breath. I care for you, Daisy. For you and for William, more than I thought possible after losing my parents, the thought of you being forced back into that man's power. He shook his head. I can't allow it, not if there's anything I can do to prevent it. But the cost is nothing compared to what I'd lose if you left. The admission seemed to surprise Matthew as much as it did Daisy. He continued more carefully, I'm not asking for anything in return. If once you're free, you wish to make your own way, I'll help you do that. Set you up somewhere safe, make sure you and William want for nothing. And if I wish to stay? Daisy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hope flared in Matthew's eyes. Then nothing would make me happier, but that's a decision for another day. First, we need to deal with Thomas. The plan proceeded with surprising speed. Joe's railroad connections proved invaluable, producing documentation of Thomas Monroe's death in the Pueblo derailment within a week. Matthew himself rode to Denver to confront Thomas, returning 2 days later with the news that Daisy's husband had accepted the substantial payment in exchange for his disappearance. He didn't even ask about William, Matthew reported, disgust evident in his voice. Just wanted to know how much money was on offer. Took the cash and was on the eastbound train within the hour. Heading for Chicago, he said, though I doubt he was telling the truth. Official notification of Thomas Monroe's death arrived by post a few days later. Daisy held the document in trembling hands, scarcely able to believe her ordeal was over. She was legally a widow now, free to make her own choices for herself and her son. What will you do? Matthew asked that evening, after William had been fed and settled for his first sleep of the night. They sat before the fire, the repaired door now solid and secure against both weather and intruders. Daisy looked around the ranch house that had become home in so short a time. She thought of the quiet strength of the man beside her who had risked so much to protect her without asking anything in return. She thought of her son who deserved to grow up in a place of safety and love. I'd like to stay, she said simply, if you'll have us. The smile that spread across Matthew's face was answer enough, but he voiced it anyway. Nothing would make me happier. He hesitated, then added, but I want to be clear about something. I'm not offering charity or merely a safe haven. My feelings for you have grown beyond friendship, Daisy. If you stay, I hope that in time you might consider. He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Consider what? Daisy prompted gently, making this arrangement permanent, becoming my wife, letting me be a father to William. The words tumbled out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for too long. Not now, you need time to heal, to be certain, but someday. Daisy reached across the space between them, taking his hand in hers. I don't need as much time as you might think, she said softly. What I feel for you, it's different from anything I've ever known. With Thomas, I was escaping something. With you, I'm moving toward something good and true. Matthew's fingers tightened around hers. I'll wait as long as you need. Until spring, perhaps, Daisy suggested, a smile playing at her lips. When the world renews itself, it seems a fitting time for new beginnings. Spring arrived early that year, the March winds giving way to April sunshine that coaxed wildflowers from the earth and tender leaves from the trees. William, now 4 months old, had grown into a sturdy, cheerful baby with his mother's dark eyes and a smile that could melt the hardest heart. On a perfect morning in late April, with the mountains still capped in snow but the ranch lands green with new life, Daisy Monroe became Daisy Quartermain in a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher. The ranch hands stood as witnesses, Jim proudly holding William throughout the brief service. I take this woman to be my lawfully wedded wife, Matthew vowed, his voice steady and sure, to love and cherish all the days of my life. When Daisy repeated her own vows, she felt none of the trepidation that had marked her first marriage. Instead, a deep certainty filled her that this man, who had opened his door to a desperate stranger on a stormy night, would never let harm come to her or her child. The years that followed proved the wisdom of her choice. Matthew formally adopted William, who grew into a strong, confident boy with his adoptive father's love of the land and his mother's quick intelligence. Two more children joined the family, a daughter, Sarah, named for Jim's wife, who had offered such valuable advice during William's birth, and another son, Joseph, named for the loyal foreman who had helped secure Daisy's freedom. The Quartermain Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. Daisy's practical sense complemented Matthew's vision, resulting in innovations that made their operation one of the most successful in the county. The library continued to grow, with books for pleasure and learning filling the shelves for all to enjoy. Thomas Monroe never reappeared. Whether he honored his agreement or simply met with a genuine misfortune elsewhere, they never knew. Occasionally, Daisy would think of him not with longing or fear, but with a kind of detached pity for a man who had been offered the precious gift of family and had thrown it away. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the twilight, Matthew turned to Daisy with a question. "Do you ever regret it, coming here that night, staying?" Daisy leaned against his shoulder, watching as William, now a lanky 10-year-old, helped his 5-year-old sister climb onto the back of a patient old pony while their 3-year-old brother clapped with excitement. "Never," she said with absolute conviction. "That storm was the best thing that ever happened to me. It brought me where I needed to be, even if I didn't know it at the time." Matthew pressed a kiss to her temple, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "When I opened that door and saw you standing there in the rain, something told me my life was about to change forever." He chuckled softly. "I just had no idea how much. For the better, I hope," Daisy teased, though she already knew the answer. "Beyond anything I could have imagined." Matthew's gaze swept over their home, their land, their children, the life they had built together from such unlikely beginnings. "You know what my mother used to say? Sometimes the greatest blessings arrive in the most unexpected packages." She was right about that, as she was about most things. Daisy smiled, thinking of the silver hairbrush she still used every night, a tangible link to the woman whose son had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "I wish I could have known her. She would have loved you," Matthew said with certainty. "Almost as much as I do." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the Colorado sky in hues of gold and crimson, Daisy reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a desperate young woman with nowhere to turn to the mistress of a thriving ranch and the beloved wife of a good man, her path had been neither straight nor easy. But every step, even the painful ones, had led her home. William called from the pasture, eager to show off his sister's riding progress. Daisy and Matthew rose together, walking hand in hand toward their children. Toward the future they continued to build, with each passing day a future founded on the simple, transformative act of a door opened on a stormy night, and the courage to step through it.